The shooting range existed in that particular silence before dawn, when even the Pacific wind held its breath against the California coastline. Master Chief Petty Officer Kira Denton moved between the rifle racks with the economy of motion that came from 2 decades of handling weapons in places where a single wasted movement meant death. Her fingers found the first M4 in the darkness, field stripping it by touch alone while the first gray light crept across Coronado. She had arrived at 0400 as she did every morning, 2 hours before any trainee would think to appear. The Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Command expected precision from its instructors and didn't deliver it in ways the official training manuals never captured. Each rifle received her attention in sequence: inspection, cleaning, lubrication, reassembly. The mechanical rhythm allowed her mind to process the day ahead while her hands performed their familiar ritual. The training roster sat on her desk in the instructor office, and she had memorized its contents before the sun touched the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. The name carried weight in certain circles, though not the kind of weight that impressed her. His team was arriving today for the advanced marksmanship course, and his reputation had preceded him through the informal networks that connected every special operations community. Political connections, family money, a senator on the Armed Services Committee who happened to share his last name. The kind of operator who collected commendations the way some men collected watches, always ensuring the right people noticed when he wore them. Denton set the 7th rifle back in its rack and allowed herself a single measured breath. She had trained operators from 12 different nations. She had put rounds through targets at distances that most shooters considered theoretical. She had done things in Syria and Afghanistan that would never appear in any file Webb could access, and she had done them when the cost of failure was measured in American lives rather than bruised egos. Whatever friction Webb brought to her training command would resolve itself the way these things always did. Performance spoke. Everything else was noise. Captain Harrison found her in the instructor office as the base began its morning awakening. He was a compact man with the weathered features of someone who had spent years in environments that aged the body faster than time alone could manage. And he closed the door behind him with the deliberate care of a man about to deliver information he would rather not share. Webb has connections, Harrison said without preamble. His uncle chairs the subcommittee that approves our funding requests. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I am aware of the situation and that my awareness changes nothing about your authority here. Denton studied her commanding officer and recognized the familiar tension in his jaw. She asked if there had been pressure applied. Inquiries, Harrison replied. Suggestions that Lieutenant Commander Webb receive every consideration during his training cycle. I informed the appropriate parties that every operator receives identical consideration at this command, which is to say they receive whatever consideration their performance earns them. You have full authority over training standards. Use it. The NATO delegation arrived at On-100 in a convoy of black SUVs that announced their importance before a single door opened. Denton observed from the parade ground as representatives from 4 allied nations emerged into the California morning, their uniforms crisp and their bearing unmistakable. Germany, Norway, France, the United Kingdom. Each nation had sent observers to evaluate American training methods, and each observer carried the quiet confidence of someone who had earned their place through demonstrated excellence rather than inherited advantage. One figure among them drew her attention with the particular magnetism of recognition. Colonel James Ashworth of the British Special Air Service stood half a head taller than his companions, his silver hair cropped close to his skull, and his eyes conducting the kind of environmental survey that marked a lifetime of operating in spaces where threats emerged without warning. Those eyes found Denton across the parade ground, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion he had carried into this assignment. Now here's a question for everyone listening right now. Where are you from? What state? What city? What corner of the world are you calling home today? Because wherever you are, I want you to think about a time when someone looked at you and decided they already knew what you were capable of. They measured you in a glance, and filed you away in whatever category made them comfortable. And I want you to remember how that felt, that moment when you realized their judgment had nothing to do with your actual abilities and everything to do with their own limitations. Denton held Ashworth's gaze for a 3 count before returning her attention to the arriving delegation. She had operated alongside SAS elements in 2019, a joint extraction that had gone sideways in ways the official reports would never capture. The darkness of that Syrian compound had hidden her features, and her call sign had been the only identification she offered. But Ashworth was studying her now with the focused attention of a man assembling puzzle pieces he had collected years ago, and she recognized the moment when those pieces began forming a coherent picture. The training week stretched ahead with all its predictable challenges and inevitable complications. Webb would arrive with his team and his assumptions. The NATO observers would watch and evaluate. And somewhere in the intersection of egos and expectations, Denton would do what she had always done. She would perform at a level that left no room for interpretation, and she would let that performance speak every truth that mattered. The morning sun climbed higher over Coronado, burning away the coastal fog and revealing the training facilities in sharp relief. Denton checked her watch and began walking toward the briefing room where Webb's team would receive their initial orientation. Whatever the week brought, she would meet it the same way she met every challenge. With precision, with patience, with the quiet certainty of someone who had proven herself in the only arena that counted. Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Reyes had learned to read his commanding officer the way a sailor reads weather patterns, watching for the subtle shifts that preceded storms. He stood at the edge of the arrival area as their transport rolled to a stop, and he watched Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb step onto Coronado soil with the expression of a man who had already decided this assignment was beneath him. The diversity hire, Webb announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the concrete with deliberate volume. They have us training under their diversity hire. Reyes felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied these moments. 18 months under Webb's command had taught him the rhythm of these performances. The loud observations designed to establish dominance before any actual interaction occurred. The casual cruelty wrapped in a language of professional concern. The way Webb's eyes swept the area to ensure his audience was properly assembled before delivering his verdict on whatever target he had selected. Chief Petty Officer Morrison caught Reyes's eye and offered the slight shake of the head that had become their shared vocabulary. Not worth it. Let it pass. The same silent counsel they exchanged whenever Webb found a new outlet for the particular brand of leadership that had somehow carried him to his current rank. The briefing room smelled of coffee and the industrial cleaning solution that seemed to permeate every military facility Reyes had ever entered. Webb positioned himself at the center of the front row, his team arranged around him in the configuration they had learned produced the least friction. Reyes took a seat near the back where he could observe without drawing attention, a habit he had developed during his first deployment when the ability to watch without being watched had kept him alive through situations that still visited his dreams. Webb was already speaking when the door opened. He was explaining to the men around him that he had reviewed the training staff credentials and found them lacking in operational experience. His voice carried the particular authority of someone who had never been required to defend his conclusions with evidence, and he was mid-sentence when she entered. Master Chief Petty Officer Denton moved to the front of the room without acknowledging the interruption, and Reyes found himself straightening in his seat despite himself. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of the operators he had encountered during joint exercises with Tier 1 units. The economy of motion, the environmental awareness that processed every face and exit in the first 2 seconds, the absolute absence of wasted energy. She introduced herself with rank and name only, then launched into a technical briefing that covered ballistic coefficients, environmental variables, and advanced ranging techniques with the fluency of someone who had internalized this knowledge through repetition under pressure. Her presentation contained no flourishes, no attempts to establish credibility through anecdote. Just information delivered with precision. Webb interrupted at the 4-minute mark. He asked how many combat deployments she had completed. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Denon paused her briefing. She regarded Webb with an expression Reyes could not quite categorize, something between assessment and patience, and she informed him that her operational record was classified at a level above his clearance. Webb laughed. The sound bounced off the walls of the briefing room with the hollow quality of performance rather than genuine amusement. He turned to his team with the showman's instinct for playing to an audience and observed that classified usually meant non-existent. Convenient, he added, for someone whose position probably came from a quota rather than qualification. Denton allowed 3 seconds of silence to establish itself before resuming her briefing exactly where she had stopped. No defense, no escalation, simply a return to the technical material, as though the interruption had been nothing more than a minor environmental disturbance. Reyes noticed movement in his peripheral vision and turned to find Colonel Ashworth seated at the observation station along the sidewall. The British officer held a tablet in his hands, and his fingers moved across its surface with the deliberate pace of someone taking detailed notes. His attention shifted between Webb and Denton with the clinical focus of a scientist documenting an experiment, and something in his expression suggested he was finding exactly what he had expected to find. The briefing concluded with Denton distributing training schedules and dismissing the group to their assigned barracks. She remained at the front of the room as the operators filed out, organizing her materials with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout, and Reyes caught himself wondering what her actual record contained. Classified meant something. In his experience, it meant the kind of operations that shaped geopolitics without ever appearing in the news, the missions where success was measured by the absence of public knowledge rather than the presence of recognition. Webb gathered his team in the barracks hallway, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial register he employed when distributing his particular brand of guidance. Reyes lingered at his locker, close enough to hear while appearing occupied with his gear. By the end of this week, Webb said, I will have exposed her for exactly what she is. A paper qualification holding a position she did not earn. When I am done, everyone on this base will know that advanced marksmanship training belongs in the hands of operators who have actually operated. Morrison nodded with a mechanical agreement that survival under Webb's command required. The other team members offered similar gestures of support, their faces carefully neutral in the way that concealed private thoughts behind public compliance. Reyes closed his locker and walked toward the showers, carrying the weight of Webb's words alongside the memory of Denton's measured response. 18 months of service under this command had taught him which battles could be fought and which required strategic patience. But something about the coming week felt different. Something about the way Ashworth had watched the exchange, documenting rather than merely observing. Something about the absolute stillness in Denton's bearing when Webb had challenged her credentials. The water ran cold before it warmed, and Reyes stood beneath its initial shock with the practiced tolerance of someone accustomed to discomfort. Whatever Webb was planning would unfold according to his timeline and his methods. And whatever Denon was concealing behind her classified record would either remain hidden or emerge under pressure. Either way, Reyes suspected he was about to witness something that would reshape his understanding of what qualified a person to lead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the outdoor range as Denton settled into the prone position. The concrete beneath her was cool through her uniform, and the Pacific wind carried just enough salt to remind her how far she was from the desert landscapes, where she had learned what shooting under pressure actually meant. 24 operators watched from the observation line as she demonstrated the proper technique for long-range precision engagement. She walked them through each element with deliberate clarity. Bone support rather than muscle tension. Natural point of aim established through body positioning rather than force correction. Breathing rhythm synchronized with trigger press. The fundamentals that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones, delivered without embellishment or ego. Webb's voice cut across her demonstration with the timing of someone who had practiced interruption as a leadership technique. He was speaking to the operators beside him, but his volume ensured everyone on the range could hear his critique. The elbow position was outdated, he observed. The breathing pattern was textbook rather than practical. Anyone who had actually engaged targets under fire knew that academy technique fell apart when bullets started flying in both directions. Denton completed her demonstration shot. The round punched through the target at 400 meters with the precision of a surgical instrument, dead center in the silhouette's head. She rose from the prone position and turned to address Webb directly. She invited him to demonstrate his preferred technique for the class. The invitation landed in the space between them with the weight of something more than professional courtesy. Webb held her gaze for a moment, and Reyes watched the calculation behind his commanding officer's eyes. Refusing would undermine the critique he had just delivered. Accepting meant performing under the scrutiny of 24 witnesses, including the NATO observers who had arranged themselves along the back of the observation line. Webb moved to the firing position with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to confront the gap between his self-assessment and his actual capabilities. He settled into his stance, made a show of adjusting his position to demonstrate his alternative technique, and pressed the trigger. The shot struck the target in the upper chest. Competent, qualifying, the kind of performance that would earn a passing mark on any standard evaluation. But 4 inches below the center point that Denton had demonstrated, and everyone on that range possessed the expertise to measure that distance without instruments. Webb fired 4 more rounds. Each one landed within an acceptable grouping, professional-grade shooting that would satisfy any standard requirement. He rose and offered his assessment to the assembled operators. Combat effective, he announced, which mattered more than precision that only existed in controlled conditions. Denton asked if she might shoot the same course for comparison. She did not wait for his response. She moved to the firing position with the fluid economy that marked her every action, settled into the prone stance Webb had criticized, and began pressing the trigger with a rhythm that seemed almost casual. Reyes counted the shots. 5 rounds in 12 seconds. He shifted his attention to the target and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The grouping was so tight it had essentially created a single hole. 5 rounds through a space that could be covered by a quarter, dead center in the silhouette's head. The distance between Webb's competent performance and Denton's demonstration was the distance between a musician who could play the notes and one who could make the instrument speak. Denton rose without comment. She did not look at Webb. She did not address the obvious disparity in their results. She simply returned to her instructor position and resumed the lesson as though the comparison had been nothing more than a routine training exercise. Webb's voice found its footing after a moment of silence. Range shooting, he declared to his team. Control conditions with no stress variables. Any woman could punch paper when nothing was shooting back. The real test came when the environment turned hostile and fine motor control degraded under adrenaline. Reyes watched his commanding officer retreat into explanation, and something shifted in his understanding of the man he had followed for 18 months. The deflection was too quick, too practiced. The response of someone who had learned to reframe every unfavorable comparison rather than acknowledge its implications. The afternoon found Reyes walking the perimeter of the training compound, processing the morning's events in the solitude he had learned to seek when his thoughts required organization. He was passing the equipment shed when he noticed the door slightly ajar, a wedge of light spilling from within. Denton sat at the workbench inside, her attention focused on a rifle unlike any Reyes had encountered in standard inventory. The weapon was clearly custom-built, its lines modified in ways that spoke to specific operational requirements. Extended barrel, specialized optics, a stock adjusted to dimensions that matched her frame exactly. The kind of weapon that operators at the highest levels commissioned for missions where standard equipment could not satisfy the demands of the objective. She looked up as his shadow crossed the threshold, and her eyes conducted the same rapid assessment he had noticed during the briefing. Threat evaluation completed in microseconds, followed by a slight relaxation that indicated he had been categorized as non-hostile. Reyes asked if he was interrupting. She told him the door was open. He stepped inside, drawn by curiosity and something else he could not quite name. The rifle on her workbench represented a level of investment and specialization that only made sense for someone who had operated at the highest tiers of the special operations community. He asked about the modifications. Denton's hands moved across the weapon as she explained. Barrel length optimized for a specific ballistic coefficient. Optics calibrated for environmental conditions she did not specify. Stock geometry adjusted through thousands of hours of live-fire refinement. Each modification represented a lesson learned in circumstances where the alternative to adaptation was failure. Reyes hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since the morning's demonstration. He asked how she dealt with people like Webb, people who refused to see what was directly in front of them. She considered the question as she reassembled a component of the trigger mechanism. Then she offered her answer with the same precision she brought to everything else. Performance speaks louder than words. Real operators know the difference. The ones who cannot see it were never going to see it, regardless of how much evidence you provide. You do your job, you maintain your standards, and you let the results speak for themselves. Reyes nodded and left her to her work, carrying her words alongside the memory of 5 rounds through a space the size of a coin. Colonel James Ashworth had spent 31 years in the Special Air Service learning to trust the instincts that had kept him alive through operations on 4 continents. Those instincts were speaking now, and he had learned long ago that ignoring them carried consequences he preferred not to pay. The secure communications room in the visiting officers' quarters hummed with the white noise generators that protected classified conversations from electronic surveillance. Ashworth settled into the chair before the encrypted terminal and initiated contact with SAS headquarters at Hereford. The connection established through a series of authentication protocols that verified his identity through biometrics, codes, and voice recognition before granting access to the restricted database he required. He typed his query with the precision of someone who understood that every keystroke on this system was logged and reviewed. Operation Midnight Sunday Syria. 2019, Joint Extraction. Female American operator. The response arrived in fragments, each piece of information released only after additional clearance verification. Ashworth read the details as they populated his screen, and the picture they assembled confirmed what he had suspected since the moment he recognized the woman on the parade ground. The extraction had occurred in a compound outside Raqqa during the final months of territorial ISIS control. Hostages from 3 allied nations. Security elements that outnumbered the rescue force by a factor of 4. The operation had been classified at the highest levels because its success had depended on methods and capabilities that no government wished to acknowledge publicly. A female American operator had been attached to the SAS element as a precision shooter. Call sign Ghost. She had eliminated 11 hostile targets during the extraction, including 4 who had been positioned to execute the hostages the moment the rescue attempt began. Her shots had come from positions that the after-action analysis described as geometrically improbable, angles that required either extraordinary luck or the kind of skill that redefined what qualified as possible. Ashworth closed the file and sat with the information for a long moment. Master Chief Petty Officer Kira Denton was not merely qualified to instruct advanced marksmanship. She was one of the most lethal precision shooters in the Western Special Operations community, and she was enduring public disrespect from a man whose combat record probably contained more embellishment than authentic achievement. He initiated a second query through the NATO liaison database, this one focused on Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. The system returned a service record that gleamed with commendations and favorable evaluations, the kind of file that typically accompanied officers destined for flag rank. But Ashworth had learned to read between the official lines, and what he found in the margins painted a different portrait. 3 formal complaints from female service members over 6 years. Each one documented incidents of hostile behavior, inappropriate comments, and professional retaliation. Each one had been administratively dismissed following intervention from channels that the records did not specify, but that Ashworth could easily infer. Political protection left fingerprints for those who knew how to recognize them. He documented his findings on his tablet, building a file that would eventually reach the appropriate authorities through channels that Webb's connections could not influence. NATO command structures operated independently of American political patronage, and Ashworth had spent 3 decades cultivating relationships that transcended national boundaries. Whatever protection Webb enjoyed domestically would find no purchase in the international community that was currently observing his conduct. Across the base, Reyes was walking toward the supply building when he heard the voice. Webb's tone carried the particular edge that preceded his most damaging performances, the verbal frequency that made subordinates instinctively check their own conduct for anything that might draw his attention. The target this time was a female logistics petty officer whose name tag read Hernandez. She stood at attention while Webb cataloged her failures at a volume designed to attract witnesses. A requisition form had contained an error, a single transposed digit in a supply code that would have been corrected in a normal course of administrative review. But Webb had found it, and Webb had decided to transform a minor clerical mistake into a public demonstration of his authority. He informed Hernandez that incompetence at her level reflected failures at every level above her. He suggested that her presence in the Navy represented exactly the kind of lowered standards that were degrading military readiness. He observed that certain people received positions they had not earned and then proved through their performance exactly why the standards existed in the first place. Reyes watched from 30 feet away, close enough to hear every word but positioned to avoid drawing Webb's attention. Hernandez maintained her bearing throughout the assault, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Webb's shoulder, her face carefully neutral in the way that concealed whatever was happening behind her expression. She responded with yes, sir, and no, sir, at appropriate intervals, offering nothing that could extend the encounter. Webb concluded with a promise to document the incident in her service record and a suggestion that she consider whether the military was really the appropriate environment for someone with her limitations. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, his stride carrying the satisfaction of someone who had reasserted the natural order of his universe. Reyes found Hernandez still standing at attention after Webb had disappeared around the corner of the supply building. He approached carefully and asked if she was all right. She looked at him with eyes that had gone somewhere far away, and then she collected herself with the discipline that military service demanded. She told him she was fine. She told him it was not the first time. She told him that certain battles could not be won through direct engagement, only endured until circumstances changed. The Officers' Club occupied a building near the waterfront where the evening light painted the Pacific in shades of orange and gold. Ashworth found Reyes there 2 hours later, nursing a drink at a table positioned to observe both entrances. The young petty officer had the look of someone carrying weight he had not chosen to pick up, and Ashworth recognized the expression from his own early years in service. He asked if he might join the table, and Reyes nodded without enthusiasm. Ashworth ordered a drink and let the silence establish itself before speaking. He mentioned that he had observed the training exercise that morning. He noted that Lieutenant Commander Webb seemed to have strong opinions about his instructor. Reyes offered a non-committal response about different leadership styles. Ashworth pressed gently. He asked about Webb's history with female service members. He asked about patterns of behavior that might extend beyond the current training cycle. The hesitation in Reyes lasted 4 heartbeats. Then something shifted behind his eyes, the decision of a man who had reached the limit of what his conscience could accommodate. Webb had friction with anyone who challenged his authority, Reyes admitted. But the friction was worse with women. Always worse. The kind of worse that left careers damaged and complaints buried and people questioning whether the service was worth the cost of enduring someone who would never face consequences for his conduct. Ashworth listened and documented and began planning the next phase of his investigation. The NATO demonstration had been scheduled for Thursday morning, positioned at the midpoint of the training week when the visiting observers would have sufficient context to evaluate American methods against their own national standards. Denon arrived at the main range 90 minutes before the scheduled start time to verify every element of the presentation she had designed. The course of fire would progress through 4 stages of increasing difficulty. Close-range rapid engagement, mid-distance precision under time pressure, long-range target acquisition with environmental compensation, and finally, a demonstration of advanced techniques that push the boundaries of what standard military training considered achievable. Each stage had been calibrated to showcase capabilities that would translate across national boundaries, universal principles that transcended the specific platforms and doctrines of any single military tradition. She checked the targets at each station, verified the ammunition counts, and confirmed the communication system that would allow observers to hear her technical commentary during the demonstration. The morning air carried the salt tang of the Pacific, and the wind conditions were holding steady at values that would require minimal adjustment to her calculations. Optimal conditions for showing what American training could produce. The observers began arriving at Height 30. Ashworth positioned himself at the center of the viewing area with the other senior NATO representatives, his tablet ready for the documentation that had become his constant companion throughout the week. The German and Norwegian contingents arranged themselves with the formal precision of their national characters, while the French observers adopted a more relaxed posture that somehow still communicated professional attention. Webb brought his team to the front row of the observation area, claiming positions that placed them directly in Denton's sightline. He had dressed for the occasion in combat utilities that bore every qualification badge his record had accumulated, a walking display of credentials that announced his status to anyone unfamiliar with the details behind the decorations. His voice carried across the range as the final observers took their positions. He was speaking to the operators beside him, but his volume ensured the commentary reached everyone present. He wondered aloud whether their instructor could actually shoot, or whether this demonstration would reveal the gap between administrative qualification and operational capability. He observed that certain positions were awarded based on factors other than merit, and suggested that the NATO representatives were about to witness exactly what those hiring practices produced. Denton walked to the first firing station and began her demonstration without acknowledging the commentary. The first stage required engaging 6 targets at 25 meters in under 4 seconds. She drew her sidearm, acquired each target in sequence, and delivered 12 rounds in 3.2 seconds. Every round center mass, every transition smooth as water flowing downhill. She moved to the second stage. Rifle work at 200 meters. 5 targets, 10 seconds. Her breathing settled into the rhythm she had perfected through countless hours of practice in environments where the consequences of failure were measured in lives rather than scores. The rifle spoke 5 times. 5 targets fell. The third stage stretched the distance to 500 meters and introduced variable target presentation. Targets appeared at random intervals from behind cover, exposing themselves for windows of less than 2 seconds before disappearing. Denton tracked each presentation and delivered her rounds with the mechanical precision of a system designed for exactly this purpose. Her hit rate held at 100% through 12 presentations. Webb's voice cut through the silence between stages. He had moved closer to the firing line, his position now only 20 feet from where Denton was preparing for the final demonstration. He directed his question at the NATO observers rather than at her, asking whether any of them had ever seen her shoot at anything that shot back. He suggested that paper targets and controlled conditions told you nothing about how a person would perform when the environment turned hostile. Denton chambered around and began her approach to the final stage. The 1,000-meter targets waited in the distance, barely visible without optics, positioned at ranges that most military shooters considered the exclusive domain of dedicated sniper teams. She had designed this stage to demonstrate that advanced training could compress years of specialized development into months of intensive instruction, that the capabilities the special operations community reserved for its most elite elements could be distributed more broadly through superior methodology. Webb crossed the remaining distance to the firing line in 4 strides. He stopped directly beside her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and he reached out and took the rifle from her hands. The motion was sudden enough to catch her off guard, his fingers closing around the barrel and stock before she could adjust her grip. He lifted the weapon away from her and announced to the assembled observers that he wanted to inspect the equipment. He suggested that perhaps the rifle itself was modified in ways that enhanced performance beyond what standard issue could achieve. He declared that any real evaluation required understanding whether the results came from skill or from technological advantage. Denton stood motionless as Webb examined her rifle with exaggerated attention. He worked the bolt. He checked the optics. He made a show of weighing the weapon in his hands as though assessing its balance. The observers watched in silence that grew heavier with each passing second. Ashworth rose from his seat. His hand moved toward his sidearm in the instinctive response of an operator who had just witnessed an assault, because taking a weapon from another service member without authorization was exactly that under military law. His eyes found Denton's across the range, and she read the question in his expression. He was asking whether she wanted him to intervene. She gave the barest shake of her head. Not yet. Webb was still performing his inspection, still delivering commentary about equipment advantages and control conditions and the difference between demonstration shooting and combat effectiveness. He was building toward something, she realized. This confrontation had been planned, and taking her rifle was only the opening movement in whatever scenario he had constructed. The NATO observers had stopped writing in their notebooks. The German colonel had leaned forward in his seat with an expression that combined disbelief with a particular anger of someone watching a professional boundary being violated. The Norwegian representative was whispering urgently to his aide. The French officer had gone very still in a way that preceded either violence or formal complaint. Denton waited. She had learned patience in places where patience meant survival, and she recognized that Webb was about to make a mistake far larger than the one he had already committed. Whatever came next would determine how this week concluded, and she intended to ensure that the conclusion left no room for interpretation. Webb finished his inspection and turned to face her with the rifle still in his hands. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally maneuvered his opponent into a position without options. He smiled and asked if she wanted to prove she actually belonged here. Webb held her rifle like a trophy, his grip communicating ownership rather than inspection. The morning sun cast a shadow across the firing line where Denton stood, and his smile carried the confidence of a man who believed he had finally cornered prey that had eluded him all week. He announced his proposal to the assembled observers with a theatrical projection of someone who had rehearsed this moment. If she was really qualified to train special operators, she should be willing to prove it against actual operators. Not paper targets, not control conditions. Real professionals who would test whether her skills existed anywhere outside the artificial environment of a demonstration range. Denton watched him gesture toward the NATO contingent, his arms sweeping to indicate 4 men who sat apart from the other observers. She recognized their unit insignia without needing introduction. 2 wore the patches of Germany's Commandos Spezialkraft. 1 displayed the Norwegian Forsvarets Spesialkommando badge. The 4th carried the distinctive markings of France's Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale. 4 elite operators from 4 allied nations, each one representing the pinnacle of their country's special operations capability. Webb proposed the terms with the satisfaction of someone dealing cards from stacked deck. A sim-round elimination drill in the kill house. She would enter alone. The 4 commandos would hunt her. Standard training ammunition that marked hits without causing injury. Last operators standing would demonstrate, once and for all, whether theoretical qualification translated into practical capability. Ashworth was on his feet before Webb finished speaking. The British colonel moved toward the firing line with the purposeful stride of someone preparing to end this performance through whatever authority his rank provided. His hand had not left the vicinity of his sidearm since Webb had taken a rifle, and his expression communicated exactly what he thought of the scenario being proposed. Denton caught his eye across 20 feet of California morning. She held his gaze for a half second and gave him the barest nod. a communication that passed between operators who had learned to speak without words in environments where sound meant death. She was telling him to stand down. She was telling him she had this handled. She was telling him that whatever Webb thought he had engineered, the outcome would not match his expectations. Ashworth stopped. His jaw tightened with the visible effort of restraining intervention, but he recognized the signal for what it was. He returned to his position among the observers, though his posture remained coiled with the readiness of someone prepared to act the moment circumstances required. Denon turned her attention back to Webb and asked him to clarify the terms. She wanted the rules explicit and witnessed. She would enter the kill house for the primary entrance. The 4 NATO operators would position themselves inside, according to their own tactical judgment. Elimination occurred when a SIM round struck center mass or head. The exercise concluded when only one participant remained capable of engagement. Webb confirmed each element with growing enthusiasm. He added his own condition with the confidence of a man holding what he believed was an unbeatable hand. When she lost, she would acknowledge publicly that she did not belong in special operations. She would admit that her position had been awarded through factors other than merit. She would validate what he had been saying all week about standards and qualifications and the damage caused by promoting people beyond their capabilities. Reyes watched from the observation line as the terms were established. The 4 NATO commandos had risen from their seats and were conducting a quiet conference among themselves, their body language suggesting professional interest rather than reluctance. These were men who had trained for years to operate in exactly the environment Webb was proposing. They understood close-quarters battle at the cellular level. They had conducted room clearances in conditions where the targets shot back with real ammunition and genuine intent to kill. 1 woman against 4 of the most elite operators NATO could field. The mathematics were not complicated. Webb had constructed a scenario where failure was the only possible outcome, and he had done it in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to their respective commands. This was not about testing capability. This was about destruction. Denon's response cut through the murmuring that had spread among the observers. She accepted the terms. The words landed in the silence with the weight of a verdict. Webb's smile flickered for just a moment, something uncertain passing behind his eyes before confidence reasserted itself. He had expected negotiation. He had expected protest. He had expected anything except immediate acceptance delivered with the calm of someone agreeing to a routine training exercise. She removed her instructor jacket with economical movements, revealing the compact tactical vest she wore beneath. The vest was configured for close-quarters work, magazines positioned for rapid access, equipment arranged according to preferences developed through years of operational deployment. She had not dressed for a demonstration this morning. She had dressed for exactly this contingency, as though she had known what Webb was building toward before he knew it himself. She informed Webb that she would not need her custom rifle. Any weapon from the standard training rack would serve. She wanted no questions afterward about equipment advantages or technological enhancement. Whatever happened in that kill house would result from skill alone, measured against operators whose capabilities no one would question. The German KSK senior operator approached Denon as she selected a rifle from the rack. He introduced himself as Hauptmann Mueller and asked if she was certain about the terms. His tone carried no condescension, only the professional respect of one operator confirming that another understood the stakes. Denton checked the rifle's action and loaded a magazine of SIM rounds. She told Mueller that she appreciated his concern. She told him that she expected him and his colleagues to perform at their full capability. She told him that anything less would defeat the purpose of the exercise. Mueller studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, recognition perhaps, or the reassessment that occurred when initial assumptions collided with contradicting evidence. He nodded once and returned to his team to prepare for the drill. Webb had moved to the observation deck that overlooked the kill house. He positioned himself at the center of the viewing area, ensuring he would have the optimal vantage point to witness the humiliation he had orchestrated. The screens arrayed before the observers would display feeds from cameras positioned throughout the structure, capturing every moment of the exercise for review and discussion. Denon walked toward the kill house entrance with the measured pace of someone who had made this approach dozens of times before. Not in training, not in exercises, in places where the stakes were absolute and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. She paused at the threshold and looked back toward the observation deck. Her eyes found Webb among the assembled witnesses, and she held his gaze for 3 seconds without expression. Then she stepped through the door and disappeared into the shadows. The kill house swallowed light the way operational environments always did, transforming the California morning into a geography of shadows and angles that existed outside normal perception. Denton crossed the threshold and felt the familiar shift in consciousness that accompanied entry into spaces where everything moved faster than thought could process. The digital timer on the observation deck began its count the moment her boot touched the interior floor. She did not pause to let her eyes adjust. Operators who waited for adjustment died in the seconds they surrendered to physiology. Instead, she moved immediately left, pressing against the wall at an angle that eliminated her silhouette from the doorway and gave her a sight line into the first room through a gap between structural supports that most shooters would never notice. The German KSK operator had positioned himself behind a barricade 12 feet from the entrance, his weapon trained on the fatal funnel of the doorway, where any conventional entry would present an unmissable target. His positioning was textbook. His discipline was evident in his absolute stillness. He was waiting for her to make the mistake that everyone made when entering a hostile structure. Denon did not make that mistake. She identified his location through the shadow his barrel cast against the far wall, a displacement of darkness so subtle that detecting it required thousands of hours of pattern recognition burned into neural pathways through repetition. She adjusted her own weapon to an angle that conventional training would have rejected as geometrically impossible and pressed the trigger once. The sim round caught the German operator in the side of his neck, the only target his cover left exposed from her position. He registered the hit with a sharp exhale of surprise and raised his hand to signal elimination. 7 seconds had elapsed since she entered the structure. On the observation deck, Reyes watched the camera feeds with the disbelief of someone witnessing physics being rewritten. The screens showed Denton flowing through the first room like something liquid, her movements tracing paths through the structure that seemed to ignore the geometry everyone else perceived. She was not clearing the space the way training dictated. She was reading it the way a musician reads a score, anticipating what came next before it arrived. She reached the connecting hallway and stopped. The stillness lasted less than a second, but in that fraction of time, she processed information that the observers would need slow-motion replay to identify. A reflection in a door handle, the pressure differential of displaced air, the almost imperceptible sound of weight shifting on a concrete floor. The French GIGN operator and the second German had coordinated their positions to create a crossfire zone at the hallway junction. Anyone moving through would face simultaneous engagement from 2 angles, a kill box designed by professionals who had rehearsed this scenario hundreds of times. Their plan was sound. Their execution was flawless. Their assumption that she would enter their trap through conventional approach was the only flaw in their design. Denton dropped to a knee and fired twice through the gap beneath a connecting doorway. The angle should not have existed. The sightline required positioning that no standard training covered. But the sim rounds found their targets with the precision of guided systems, striking the French operator in the ankle and the German in the knee. Both men stumbled from the unexpected impacts at floor level, their weapons momentarily displaced from their intended firing solutions. She was through the doorway before they could recover, 2 more rounds delivered at center mass while they were still processing how their ambush had reversed. 34 seconds total elapsed. 3 operators eliminated. Ashworth leaned forward in his seat, his voice barely above a whisper as he provided commentary to the stunned observers beside him. He recognized those techniques. The angle work, the unconventional sight lines, the exploitation of geometric gaps that standard doctrine dismissed as unusable. These were principles from the SAS close-quarters methodology, but executed at a level that exceeded what Hereford taught its own operators. He had seen this before, in fragmentary after-action reports, in the classified documentation of Operation Midnight Sunday, in the whispered legends that circulated through the special operations community about an American shooter whose capabilities defied categorical description. The Norwegian FSK operator was the most experienced of the four, a senior sergeant with deployments spanning 15 years and 3 continents. He had watched his colleagues fall through the camera feed mounted on his tactical helmet, and he had immediately abandoned his original position to implement a flanking maneuver that exploited the one blind spot in the structure's layout. He moved through the back corridor with the silent precision of someone who had hunted human targets in environments far more hostile than a training facility. His approach vector would bring him to a position behind Denton's last known location, allowing engagement from an angle she could not anticipate if she maintained her current direction of movement. Denton had stopped moving. She stood in the center of the main room, her weapon lowered, her posture suggesting vulnerability that every operator on the observation deck recognized as impossibly careless. The Norwegian adjusted his grip and prepared to take the shot that would salvage something from this exercise. She turned before he cleared the corner. The motion was so fast that the camera feeds would later require frame-by-frame analysis to deconstruct. She had anticipated not just his approach, but his exact timing, reading his movement pattern through indicators that existed below conscious perception. The methodical pace of a careful operator, the slight hesitation before committing to exposure, the rhythm that 15 years of experience had burned into his operational signature. Her sim round caught him mid-stride, center mass, delivered with the casual precision of someone who had never doubted the outcome. 79 seconds total elapsed. 4 operators eliminated. The observation deck had gone completely silent. Webb stood frozen at the center of the viewing area, his expression cycling through emotions too quickly to catalog. Disbelief, denial, the dawning recognition that everything he thought he understood about the woman he had challenged was catastrophically incomplete. Denton walked toward the kill house exit with her weapon in safe carry position. Her breathing had not elevated. Her movements showed no indication of exertion or stress. She emerged into the California sunlight and continued walking without pause, her trajectory carrying her directly toward the observation deck where Webb waited. The 4 NATO commandos followed her out of the structure in sequence, each one displaying the particular expression of professionals who had just encountered something that would require significant revision to their understanding of what was possible. Mueller, the German senior operator, was shaking his head slowly as he walked, the gesture of a man replaying events that still did not conform to his expectations. Denton climbed the steps to the observation deck and stopped 3 feet from Webb. She did not speak. She did not need to. 79 seconds of performance had communicated everything that words could not convey. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and everyone present understood that whatever came next would determine how this story ended. Webb's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He stood at the center of the observation deck like a man watching a building collapse in slow motion, unable to move, unable to process, unable to reconcile what he had witnessed with the narrative he had constructed over the course of the week. 79 seconds. For elite operators, the mathematics refused to compute no matter how many times his mind ran the calculation. The NATO commandos emerged from the kill house in sequence, each one pausing at the exit to orient themselves before walking toward the observation area. Their body language told a story that required no translation. These were men who had trained for years to operate at the highest levels of their profession, and they had just encountered something that existed outside their framework of possibility. Mueller reached the observation deck first. The German KSK senior operator walked past Webb without acknowledgement, his attention fixed entirely on the woman who had eliminated him in 7 seconds through an angle he still could not reconstruct in his memory. He stopped in front of Denton and extended his hand with the formal respect that warriors reserved for those who had demonstrated undeniable excellence. He asked for a call sign. The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. In the special operations community, call signs were more than radio identifiers. They were reputations compressed into single words, histories that preceded their owners into every room and operation. Denton accepted his handshake and answered, "Ghost." Mueller's expression shifted through recognition into something approaching reverence. He released her hand and stepped back with a slight bow of his head, the acknowledgement of a legend he had heard whispered in classified briefings but never expected to encounter in person. He turned to his fellow operators and spoke rapidly in German, and Reyes watched their faces transform as they processed whatever information he was sharing. Webb found his voice in the space created by the exchange. He announced to anyone listening that the exercise proved nothing about real combat capability. Training scenarios with sim rounds bore no resemblance to actual engagements where the stakes were life and death. Anyone could perform in control conditions. The true test came when bullets flew in both directions and the margin for error disappeared entirely. The words fell into silence like stones dropped into still water. No one responded. No one needed to. The 4 operators Webb had recruited for his demonstration stood in a loose cluster near Denton, their positioning communicating alliance more clearly than any verbal declaration could manage. Ashworth moved from his observation position with the deliberate pace of someone about to deliver information that would reshape the immediate future. He stopped at the edge of the platform where Webb stood and identified himself formally. Colonel James Ashworth, Special Air Service, currently attached to NATO Special Operations Command as a training evaluation officer. He stated that he had been documenting the events of this training week for submission to both NATO headquarters and United States Special Warfare Command. Webb's face lost 2 shades of color as the implications registered. NATO documentation meant international visibility. Warcom notification meant the American Special Operations leadership would receive a detailed account of everything that had transpired. The political protection that had shielded his career for years operated within specific boundaries, and those boundaries did not extend to incidents witnessed and recorded by Allied military observers. Ashworth continued with the measured delivery of someone reading charges. He noted that at on and of 4 to 7, Lieutenant Commander Webb had physically taken a weapon from the hands of a training instructor without authorization or legitimate cause. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, this action constituted assault. He further noted that the subsequent challenge, which placed the instructor in a 4-against-stone combat scenario, had created a hostile training environment that violated multiple regulations governing professional conduct. The observation deck had become very quiet. The other NATO representatives had risen from their seats and were gathering behind Ashworth in a formation that communicated unified support for his assessment. The German colonel who had watched the demonstration with such visible anger now stood at Ashworth's right shoulder, his presence adding the weight of Allied consensus to the British officer's statement. Webb attempted to interrupt, to explain, to reframe the events in terms that might salvage something from the wreckage of his miscalculation. His voice cracked on the first word, and he stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. He suggested that the exercise had been voluntary. He pointed out that the instructor had accepted the challenge of her own free will. He argued that no harm had occurred and therefore no violation had taken place. Ashworth's response was delivered without inflection. He observed that coercion did not require physical force. A subordinate challenged publicly by a superior officer in front of international observers, with her professional reputation explicitly at stake, could not be considered to have volunteered freely. The power differential alone rendered any claim of voluntary participation legally meaningless. Movement at the edge of the training area drew everyone's attention. Captain Harrison was approaching from the direction of the command building, his stride carrying the urgency of someone who had received information that demanded immediate response. Ashworth's aide walked beside him, tablet in hand, presumably having delivered the summary that had prompted the commanding officer's arrival. Harrison climbed to the observation deck and surveyed the scene with the quick assessment of an experienced officer reading a tactical situation. His eyes moved from Webb to Denton to the cluster of NATO operators to Ashworth and back to Webb. Whatever calculation he performed took less than 5 seconds to complete. He addressed Webb directly. Effective immediately, the lieutenant commander was relieved of all training participation pending formal investigation into the events of the morning. He was to return to visiting officer quarters and remain there until further notice. He was prohibited from contacting any personnel involved in the incident. His communication devices would be collected within the hour. Webb's protest died before it reached his lips. Harrison's tone carried the finality of a door closing, and even the political connections that had protected Webb's career could not override a direct order from a commanding officer acting on documented misconduct. Reyes watched his team leader descend from the observation deck with the posture of a man walking toward an ending he had never imagined possible. 18 months of service under Webb's command had conditioned him to expect that consequences flowed in only one direction, always downward, never touching those who occupied positions of authority. But the system that Webb had manipulated so successfully was responding now, and its response carried the weight of international observation and formal documentation. Denton had not moved from her position near the NATO operators. Her expression remained neutral, professional, revealing nothing of whatever satisfaction she might have felt watching the man who had taken her rifle being escorted from the training area. Harrison approached her and spoke quietly, words intended for her alone. Whatever he said produced a single nod from Denton and nothing more. She turned to Mueller and the other commandos and suggested they debrief the exercise while the details remained fresh. Her voice carried the same measured calm it had displayed throughout the week, as though the events of the morning had been nothing more than a routine training evolution. The German operator smiled for the first time since exiting the kill house. He told her it would be an honor to learn how she had achieved angles his training had taught him were impossible. They walked together toward the debriefing room, for elite operators following a woman they had been sent to defeat, and Reyes understood that he had just witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of what leadership actually meant. The secure video connection linked Coronado to Special Warfare Command headquarters in Virginia with the encrypted clarity that classified communications required. Admiral David Chun occupied the center of the screen, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a flag officer receiving information that would require significant institutional response. Ashworth sat before the terminal in the visiting officer's secure briefing room. His documentation, arranged in the precise order he had learned, produced maximum impact during 30 years of military briefings. He began with the events of the morning, presenting the video footage captured by range cameras and observation deck recordings. The sequence played without commentary needed. Webb approaching the firing line. Webb taking the rifle from Denton's hands. Webb issuing his challenge with the smugness of someone certain of the outcome. And then 79 seconds of footage that would circulate through special operations commands on 3 continents before the week concluded. Admiral Chun watched the kill house footage twice before speaking. He asked Ashworth for his professional assessment of the instructor's performance. Ashworth chose his words with care. He stated that Master Chief Denton had demonstrated close-quarters combat capabilities that exceeded the operational standards of every NATO Special Operations unit he had observed in 3 decades of service. He noted that her techniques appeared to derive from methodologies that existed only at the highest classification levels, suggesting operational experience that her official record did not reflect. The Admiral's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He ordered Webb's complete service record unsealed for review, overriding the administrative protections that had kept certain files inaccessible to standard inquiry. The records populated a screen within minutes, and Ashworth watched Chin's face as the flag officer processed information that painted a portrait very different from the decorated hero Webb's public file suggested. 2 combat commendations that investigation would later confirm had been awarded for operations actually led by other team members. Fitness reports containing language that praised leadership qualities while carefully avoiding specific operational achievements. A pattern of advancement that correlated precisely with interventions from political channels rather than performance evaluations. And buried beneath layers of administrative redirection, 3 formal complaints from female service members that had been dismissed through processes that circumvented normal investigative procedures. Chen's voice carried the cold precision of command authority when he spoke again. He ordered a full JAG investigation with NATO observer participation. He authorized witness interviews with all personnel who had served under Webb's command. He specified that political interference in the investigation would be treated as obstruction and prosecuted accordingly. 3 hours later, Reyes sat in the base legal office facing a JAG lieutenant commander whose recorder captured every word for the official record. The room smelled of coffee and paper and the particular tension that accompanied formal testimony, and Reyes felt the weight of 18 months pressing against the words he was about to speak. The investigator asked him to describe Lieutenant Commander Webb's leadership style in his own words. Reyes began with the incidents he had witnessed directly. The credit Webb claimed for tactical decisions made by subordinates. The punishment delivered to anyone who questioned his judgment. The way mission successes became Webb's achievements, while failures rolled downhill to land on whoever stood closest to the impact zone. He described the systematic dismantling of a young petty officer's career after she had the misfortune of outperforming Webb during a training exercise. He detailed the informal networks Webb had constructed to ensure that complaints never reached reviewers who might take them seriously. The testimony continued for 2 hours. Reyes answered every question with the precision he had learned during years of operational debriefs, providing dates and locations and witnesses who could corroborate each incident. The fear he had carried throughout his service under Webb's command transformed into something else as he spoke. Relief, perhaps, or the particular clarity that came from finally aligning external behavior with internal conviction. When he emerged from the legal office, 2 other members of Webb's team were waiting in the corridor. Morrison met his eyes first, and something passed between them that required no verbal expression. The senior chief nodded once and walked into the office Reyes had just vacated. Petty Officer Chun followed 30 minutes later. Then Petty Officer Wallace. Then Chief Santos. The corridor outside the legal office became an informal gathering point for operators who had finally found a channel through which truth could flow without obstruction. Each one carried stories that expanded the picture, taking shape in the investigative record. Each one added weight to the pattern that Webb's political protection could no longer conceal. Ashworth returned to the secure briefing room that evening for a follow-up communication with Warcom. Admiral Chin appeared on screen with an expression that had evolved from cold anger to something more complex. A mixture of vindication and institutional shame that reflected the magnitude of what the investigation was uncovering. The British colonel made his final request of the day. He asked that Master Chief Dinnan's classified service record be partially unsealed for inclusion in the investigation file. The request required admiral-level authorization, and Chin granted it without hesitation. The file populated Ashworth's screen in segments, each classification level releasing additional information as his clearance was verified against the document's access requirements. He read in silence as the portrait emerged from redacted operational summaries and coded mission designations. 11 confirmed hostile eliminations during Operation Midnight Sun in Syria. 7 additional eliminations during operations in Afghanistan that remained classified at levels even his clearance could not fully access. Instructor certification at 3 NATO advanced training commands. Qualification ratings that placed her among the top 5 precision shooters in the United States military inventory. And 1 designation that explained everything else. First woman to successfully complete selection for the United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGRU. the unit whose name was spoken in whispers even within the special operations community. The Tier 1 element that conducted missions so sensitive that their existence was rarely acknowledged and never discussed. Ashworth leaned back from the screen and allowed himself a moment to process what he had just read. Webb had challenged a woman whose operational record made his own look like a training exercise. He had demanded she prove herself against elite operators when she had eliminated more hostile targets in actual combat than most special operators encountered in entire careers. Admiral Chen's voice broke the silence. He observed that the investigation would proceed through formal channels, but the outcome was no longer in question. Webb would face court-martial for assault, conduct unbecoming, and falsification of official records. His political protection had evaporated the moment NATO documentation entered the equation. The Admiral paused before adding one final observation. He noted that Master Chief Denon had been offered flag-level recognition for her service on multiple occasions and had declined each time, preferring to continue operational duties rather than accept positions that would have elevated her visibility. The investigation would not change that preference. Her record would return to classified status once proceedings concluded. Ashworth understood. Some warriors preferred shadows to spotlights. Some achievements needed no audience beyond those who had been there when they occurred. Ghost would remain exactly what her call sign suggested. The base chapel offered the only privacy Webb could find on a facility where every eye seemed to track his movements with a particular attention reserved for those whose fall had become public entertainment. He pressed himself into an alcove near the back entrance and dialed the number he had memorized years ago, the direct line to Senator Richard Webb's private office that had solved every problem his career had encountered. The call connected on the fourth ring. Not the senator's voice. His chief of staff, a woman named Patterson whose job involved filtering access to power and managing the complications that powerful men accumulated. She informed Webb that the senator was unavailable for personal calls during the current legislative session. When Webb pressed, identifying himself and the urgency of his situation, her tone shifted into something colder. She told him the senator had been briefed on the situation at Coronado. She told him that NATO involvement had elevated the matter beyond the scope of constituent services. She told him that the senator's office would not be providing assistance with what she termed personnel matters that had attracted international attention. The phrase carried the surgical precision of language crafted to create distance without explicitly acknowledging the relationship it was severing. Webb ended the call and stood in the chapel's shadow while the full weight of his circumstances settled around him. 20 years of careful cultivation had built the network that protected his career. Political connections, favorable assignement, complaints redirected, and witnesses discouraged, and records adjusted to show the version of events that served his advancement. The architecture of his success had seemed permanent, an infrastructure of influence that would carry him to flag rank and beyond. 79 seconds had demolished all of it. He found Denton outside her quarters that evening, returning from the training facilities where she had spent the day conducting normal instruction as though the investigation consuming the rest of the base had nothing to do with her. She walked with the same measured efficiency she brought to everything, her bearing unchanged by the events that had transformed Webb's existence into a countdown toward consequences. He stepped into her path and demanded she withdraw her complaint. Denton stopped 3 feet from him and regarded his presence with an expression that suggested mild curiosity about an unexpected obstacle. She informed him that she had not filed a complaint. The investigation had originated from NATO command documentation submitted by Colonel Ashworth. She had provided testimony when requested, nothing more. Webb felt something crack in the facade he had maintained throughout the day. He told her she could end this. She could tell them the exercise had been voluntary. She could explain that the challenge had been professional rather than hostile. She could save both their careers by simply describing events in terms that did not require institutional response. Her expression did not change. She asked him why she would do that. The question landed with the weight of genuine incomprehension, as though the possibility of protecting him had never occurred to her as an option worth considering. Webb searched for leverage and found only the threat that had served him throughout his career. He warned her that he still had connections. He warned her that careers could be damaged through channels that left no fingerprints. He warned her that she was making an enemy who would remember this moment long after the current investigation concluded. Denton's response carried no anger, no fear, no reaction to his threats beyond a slight adjustment to her posture that somehow communicated absolute dismissal. She told him that her career consisted of classified actions that would never appear in any file he could access. She told him that the people who determined her assignments did not answer to senators or respond to informal pressure campaigns. She told him that whatever damage he imagined he could inflict would require first knowing where to aim, and the targets he sought existed in shadows he could not penetrate. She stepped around him and continued toward her quarters without looking back. Admiral Chun had established a temporary office in the command building for the duration of his investigation oversight. Webb received the summons at 0700 the following morning, a formal notification that required his presence at on 100 with legal representation, if desired. He arrived alone, having calculated that a lawyer's presence would signal guilt before any charges were formally presented. The admiral sat behind a desk arranged with the documentation that would determine Webb's future. Video files, witness statements, service records, complaint histories, the accumulated evidence of a career built on foundations that were now being examined with the detailed attention they had always deserved but never received. Chun began without preamble. He presented the evidence in sequence, each element adding weight to the picture taking shape. The combat commendations awarded for operations Webb had not led. The fitness reports containing language that investigation revealed had been copied from subordinates' actual achievements. The complaints from female service members that had been dismissed through administrative interventions traced back to political contacts rather than legitimate review processes. Webb attempted to interrupt, to provide context, to offer the explanations he had prepared during sleepless hours. Chun raised one hand, and the words died in Webb's throat. The admiral continued. He described the events at the training range as documented by 7 camera angles and 43 witnesses. He noted that Webb had physically taken a weapon from an instructor without authorization. He observed that the subsequent challenge had placed that instructor in a scenario designed to produce her public humiliation. He characterized the entire sequence as conduct unbecoming an officer of the United States Navy. Webb found his voice long enough to argue that Denton had provoked the confrontation through her attitude, that her refusal to acknowledge his experience had created the conditions that led to the challenge, that she had been waiting for exactly this opportunity to embarrass him in front of international observers. Chun touched a control on his desk, and the wall screen activated. The range footage played without sound, showing Webb's approach to the firing line, his hand reaching for the rifle, his removal of the weapon from Denton's grip. The footage showed her standing motionless throughout, her body language displaying nothing that could be characterized as provocation or aggression. The admiral asked Webb to identify the specific moment in the footage where provocation occurred. The silence stretched for 30 seconds before Chun spoke again. He informed Webb that he was being removed from command effective immediately. He stated that charges would include assault, conduct unbecoming, and falsification of official records pending complete review of his service history. He noted that court-martial proceedings would commence within 60 days and that Webb should expect pre-trial confinement if he attempted to contact witnesses or interfere with ongoing investigation. Webb's career had taken 20 years to construct. Its destruction required less than 10 minutes of formal notification delivered in an admiral's temporary office on a training base, where he had expected to humiliate a woman who had dared to occupy space he believed belonged exclusively to men like himself. He was escorted from the building by 2 master sitarms who had been waiting outside the door. The walk across the base to pretrial confinement took 4 minutes. Every step carried the weight of inevitability that he had somehow never imagined applying to himself. The assembly area filled with personnel from every element of the training command, Uniforms arranged in formation rows that stretched across the parade ground in the morning light. Admiral Chun stood at the podium that had been erected for the occasion, his flag rank insignia catching the California sun as he surveyed the gathered operators, instructors, and support staff. The NATO delegation occupied positions of honor at the front, their presence lending international weight to whatever announcement was about to reshape the command's understanding of recent events. Chun began by acknowledging the disruption the investigation had caused to normal training operations. He thanked the personnel who had provided testimony and the Allied observers whose documentation had ensured accurate understanding of the events in question. His tone carried the formal precision of official communication, each word chosen for the record that would preserve this moment. He summarized the findings without dwelling on details that would emerge through court-martial proceedings. A senior officer had engaged in conduct unbecoming. That officer had been removed from command and would face appropriate consequences through military justice channels. The investigation had revealed patterns of behavior that should have been addressed years earlier, and systemic failures would be examined to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. Then his tone shifted into something warmer, and he turned his attention to Denton, where she stood among the instructor cadre. He announced that Master Chief Petty Officer Kira Denton's authority as lead instructor for advanced marksmanship training was formally reaffirmed with commendation. He noted that she had maintained absolute professional conduct throughout a deliberate campaign of provocation and hostility. He observed that her performance during the training exercise had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded the standards of every Allied Special Operations unit represented at the command. The Admiral paused and added one observation that was not part of his prepared remarks. He said that the naval special warfare community was stronger for her presence in it, and that future generations of operators would benefit from instruction delivered by someone who had proven herself in the most demanding environments the profession could offer. Applause broke across the assembly area, beginning with the NATO contingent and spreading through the gathered personnel until the sound filled the parade ground. Denton stood at attention throughout, her expression neutral, accepting the recognition with the same composure she had displayed during every other moment of the week. Mueller stepped forward from the NATO delegation and requested formal permission to address the assembly. Chun granted it with a gesture, and the German KSK operator walked to the podium with the bearing of someone about to deliver information that mattered deeply to him. He announced that the 4 NATO commandos who had participated in the training exercise were formally requesting permission to complete the remainder of the advanced marksmanship course under Master Chief Denton's instruction. He stated that the 79 seconds in the kill house had taught them more about close-quarters methodology than months of conventional training could provide. He observed that warriors learned best from those who had demonstrated mastery beyond question, and Master Chief Denton had demonstrated exactly that. The other 3 commandos stepped forward to stand beside Mueller, their positioning communicating solidarity with his request. Chun glanced at Denton, who gave the barest nod of acceptance, and the Admiral formally approved the continuation of their training assignment. The assembly dispersed into the normal rhythms of base activity, but Reyes lingered near the instructor office where Denton had retreated to process the morning's events. He found her organizing training materials at her desk, her attention focused on preparation for afternoon instruction as though flag-level recognition was simply another task to be completed and filed away. He knocked on the door frame and waited for her acknowledgement before entering. He told her that he wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier, for standing by while Webb conducted his campaign against her, for the 18 months of silence that had preceded his testimony to the investigators. Denton set down the materials she had been organizing and gave him her full attention. She told him that speaking up when it mattered was what counted. She told him that the system failed when good people convinced themselves that silence was the only safe option. She told him that his testimony had provided corroboration that strengthened every other witness statement, and that kind of courage multiplied. Reyes felt something release in his chest, a tension he had carried since the first day he had recognized what kind of leader Webb actually was. He thanked her and turned to leave. Her voice stopped him at the doorway. She told him that operators who recognized problems and then found the courage to address them were exactly what the community needed. She told him his career would take him wherever his abilities deserved, and that she would ensure his actions during this investigation were documented in ways that future commanding officers would appreciate. Ashworth appeared in the corridor as Reyes departed, the British colonel carrying something in his closed fist that he presented to Denton with ceremony that suggested ritual significance. He opened his palm to reveal a coin bearing the winged dagger insignia of the Special Air Service. The metal had the worn patina of something carried through years of service, edges smoothed by constant handling, surface marked by the particular damage that accumulated during operational deployment. He told her that this coin had been given to him by his commanding officer after his first successful hostage extraction 30 years ago. He told her that he had carried it through every subsequent operation as a reminder of what the profession demanded and what it offered in return. He told her that the operators she had worked alongside in Syria spoke of her with reverence that he now understood completely. She accepted the coin with both hands and studied its surface for a long moment before looking up to meet his eyes. She told him she would carry it with the weight it deserved. The afternoon brought one final development that Denton had not anticipated. Senior Chief Morrison appeared at her office door with the remaining members of Webb's team arranged behind him in the corridor. Their expressions carried the uncertainty of people navigating territory that had no established protocols. Morrison spoke for the group. He explained that they had been offered reassignment to other training commands, given the circumstances. He explained that they had discussed the option and unanimously declined. He explained that they wanted to complete their training under her instruction, regardless of the associations their presence might carry. He added that they had learned more watching 79 seconds of her performance than they had absorbed in years under their former commander. He asked if she would have them. Denton considered the group for several seconds, reading their faces the way she had learned to read terrain and tactical situations. Whatever she found there satisfied something, because her response came with a hint of warmth that rarely surfaced in her professional interactions. She told them training resumed at 0600 tomorrow. She told them the standards would not adjust for their circumstances. She told them that what they had learned under their previous commander would need to be examined and in some cases discarded. Morrison nodded and led his team away to prepare for what the morning would bring. Denton returned to her desk and the training materials that required her attention. The SAS coin now resting in her pocket, where she would carry it alongside the other tokens of career that existed largely in shadows. 3 months had reshaped the training command in ways that extended far beyond the departure of a single officer. The shooting range that had witnessed Webb's miscalculation now hosted the final qualification exercise for the advanced marksmanship cycle, and Denton stood at the instructor station watching operators she had trained prepare to demonstrate what they had learned. Reyes settled into the prone position at the 1,000-meter line, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm she had taught him during weeks of intensive instruction. The custom techniques she had developed through years of operational deployment had been translated into methodology that could be transmitted, principles that elevated capable shooters into exceptional ones. He had absorbed every lesson with the hunger of someone who understood that he was learning from a master whose knowledge existed nowhere in official curriculum. The course of fire began at his signal. He engaged targets at increasing distances with the mechanical precision that separated qualification from excellence, each round finding its mark within tolerances that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. His groupings tightened as the distance increased, counterintuitive results that demonstrated complete internalization of the environmental compensation techniques Denton had drilled into her students. His final score exceeded every previous record for the qualification course. Denton marked the result in the official log without commentary, her expression revealing nothing of whatever satisfaction she might have felt watching a student surpass expectations she had set deliberately high. Mueller had returned to Coronado 2 weeks earlier, his reassignment to the training command as an exchange instructor representing exactly the kind of international cooperation that NATO partnerships were designed to produce. He stood beside Denton at the instructor station, observing the qualification exercise with the professional attention of someone who had learned firsthand what her training could accomplish. The 79 seconds that had eliminated him in the kill house had become a teaching tool, analyzed and dissected in briefings that circulated through special operations commands across Europe. The German operator had requested this posting specifically, citing professional development opportunities that existed nowhere else in the Allied training infrastructure. His actual motivation required no explanation to anyone who had witnessed the events of that Thursday morning. Some lessons could only be learned from those who had demonstrated mastery beyond question, and Mueller had recognized in Denton a teacher whose methodology would reshape his understanding of what the profession could achieve. The graduation ceremony occupied the same assembly area where Admiral Chun had delivered his findings 3 months earlier. Denton moved through the formation, pinning qualification badges on operators who had earned them, her movements efficient and her interactions brief. She reached Reyes and paused for a fraction of a second longer than she had with the others. She pinned his badge and spoke a single word. Earned. The weight of that acknowledgement settled into Reyes with the permanence of something that would remain long after the ceremony concluded. He had arrived at this command following a leader whose example taught the wrong lessons about what authority meant and how power should be exercised. He was leaving with understanding that would shape every leadership decision he made throughout whatever career lay ahead. The new training cycle brought candidates whose presence signaled changes that extended beyond individual achievement. 3 women stood among the arrivals processing through initial orientation, their uniforms bearing the insignia of units that had only recently opened advanced training opportunities to female operators. They had heard about the Ghost. They had read the reports that circulated through unofficial channels despite classification restrictions. They were here because someone had demonstrated that the barriers they faced were constructed from assumption rather than capability. Denton observed their arrival from the range, where she was preparing equipment for the instruction cycle that would begin the following morning. She recognized the particular determination in their bearing, the posture of people who understood they would face scrutiny that their male counterparts would never encounter. She had carried that weight throughout her own career, and she knew that some of them would discover reserves of capability they had never suspected, while others would find the demands exceeded what they could sustain. The process would sort them fairly. That was what mattered. Standards applied equally produced results that required no qualification or explanation. Her secure terminal carried a message from Ashworth when she returned to her quarters that evening. The British colonel had returned to Hereford after completing his evaluation assignment, but he had maintained contact through channels that existed outside official correspondence. His message contained information that the formal notification system would deliver within days, but that he wanted her to receive first. Webb had accepted a plea agreement rather than face full court-martial proceedings. Guilty to assault, conduct unbecoming, and 3 counts of falsifying official records. Reduction in rank to lieutenant. Separation from naval service with other than honorable conditions. Forfeiture of retirement benefits accumulated across 20 years of service built on foundations that had finally been examined with appropriate scrutiny. Denton read the message twice and then deleted it according to secure communication protocols. The outcome matched what the evidence had demanded. Justice had operated as designed when given accurate information and protection from interference. Webb would carry the consequences of his choices into whatever civilian existence awaited him, and the system he had manipulated would be marginally more resistant to similar manipulation in the future. She thought about the question that had been forming since the morning's graduation ceremony. The question of what proof actually meant and how it was most effectively delivered. And here's something I want everyone listening to consider. Think about the moments in your own life when you had to prove something that others refused to believe. Think about whether you chose words or action, explanation or demonstration. Think about which proof stayed with the people who witnessed it. Because some arguments can be won through logic and persuasion, but others require 79 seconds of undeniable performance that leaves no room for interpretation. Which kind of proof do you remember longest? Which kind changed what you believed was possible? The range waited in pre-dawn darkness when Denton arrived the following morning, the same hour she had kept throughout her assignment to the training command. She moved between the rifle racks with the efficiency of long practice, preparing equipment for another day of instruction that would shape operators who would carry her methods into environments she might never see. Mueller found her there 30 minutes later, his own internal clock having adjusted to the rhythms she maintained. He took position at the adjacent workbench and began his own preparation routine without requiring direction. They worked in companionable silence while the California sky lightened toward dawn. The new candidates would arrive at 0600. Some would exceed expectations. Some would discover limitations they had not anticipated. All of them would encounter standards that made no allowances for circumstance or identity, only performance measured against requirements that applied equally to everyone. Denton chambered around and verified her sight picture against the distant targets that the growing light was beginning to reveal. Another day, another cycle, another opportunity to demonstrate that excellence recognized no boundaries except those imposed by individual commitment and capability. Ghost would remain in the shadows where she preferred to operate, teaching lessons that would propagate through generations of operators who would never know her face, but would carry her methods into whatever challenges the future presented. The sun broke the horizon, and the training day began.